Good morning. Thank you for joining me for this week's video. My name is Jeff Corintier. I guess you can see that right on the bottom of my screen. I'm from Arcanum Holistic Clinic, and I've been doing this series of videos. You may have been joining me in some of the recent weeks. And the main theme of this series is to take the core philosophy of medical Heilkunst, the thing that really we operate on every day in the clinic when it comes to treating patients, but the whole goal of this video series is to take this philosophy and bring it out to everyday use, take it out of the specialist's hands and make it something available to the benefit of everyone. So if you've been following along, in our last week's video, we were talking about basically the idea of bias or presumption and how that is basically contrary to the goals of science, whether a bias is conscious or unconscious, it really ruins that primary goal of science. We're going to continue on that theme today and what we were talking about last week, and we're going to examine a very specific example of that. We're going to do a little bit of a case study, and the specific example is when the worldview or the bias is that of materialism. And that is, of course, it's a very bad bias to have. Any bias is bad to have, but that one is a bad one to have in science, any kind of science, and it's also bad just to have in everyday life. Just as I've said previously, just our everyday normal, day-to-day living is when we're engaged with it at a higher level, it is itself a kind of an informal science. We're kind of engaged with some of the same goals that we are in our more formal sciences. So anyways, that's the topic of today. Pulling out of the theme from last week, we're going to do this case study of materialism and how that bias in particular is one of the big ones that really blocks this dynamic process of living thinking. We've been talking about living thinking, but we need to, if we're trying to get to a goal such as living thinking, we need to know how to how to not make the errors that are going to prevent us from getting to that goal. So let me, I'm just going to, I'm going to share my screen. I'm just going to click the right buttons here. And I'll go over to here. So I just have this excerpt from a Kindle book open. This is actually from Rudolf Steiner's book, The Philosophy of Freedom. And I'm in chapter 3, paragraph 17. You can see this little 17 here at the top. And I'm just going to read some of the excerpts here, and I'm going to comment on them as I go, but I'm going to link them back to our main topic here. Now, this just being a series of excerpts, obviously, this book goes quite in depth into this particular topic that it's talking about, but I'm just going to use some of these excerpts for our purposes today. So I'm going to link it back to what we've been talking about in this video series. So let me just go through some of these highlights here. This paragraph opens with, "This transparent clarity we experience in relation to the thinking process is completely independent of our knowledge of the physiological bases of thinking." So what he's saying there, and of course we're just jumping in the middle of this chapter here, so I'll give you a bit of the context of what he's talking about. When he's talking about the physiological bases of thinking, he's in the process of critiquing a lot of the usual bias that comes, especially in our modern sciences, the bias that comes in around the brain and thinking is that the whole idea of the mind and what thinking is, what consciousness is, gets reduced to brain activity. So, the presumption there is that all we have to do is understand everything that's happening in the brain, excuse me, all the brain chemistry, all the chemical interactions, the neurotransmitters, all these things that are happening in the brain. It's presumed that all we need to do is find out everything that's happening at the brain level, and that from there, then we can understand the mind. But he is criticizing this as being a false idea. And when he uses this phrase here, this transparent clarity, what he was talking about previous in this chapter was the clarity he's referring to there is the experience we have of our own thinking is a direct, clear experience. When if you sit and have a thought, or even direct your thinking to go in a certain direction about a certain topic, the clarity, that experience of thinking, that it's just right there before you. You don't need to know anything about brain chemistry to see the clarity of that thought. It's just right there in front of you. You're in the thought, you are the thought, you're having the thought, however you want to say that. There's such a clarity to that, such a direct experience. And all of this business of positing, the activity of brain chemistry and everything else, that's secondary. That is not our direct experience. So anyways, that's what he's talking about right here in this first sentence of this transparent clarity. That's the clarity he's been talking about in this chapter so far. So anyways, I just wanted to give you that context, and I'm going to go on to this second blurb where he says, observation tells me that nothing guides me in combining my thoughts except the content of the thoughts. I am not guided by the material processes in my brain. In a less materialistic age than our own, this observation would of course be completely superfluous. But today, when there are people who believe that once we know what matter is, we will also know how matter thinks. So anyways, he's just kind of making this funny turn of phrase here, that the presumption of brain science and brain chemistry, it really is this this kind of goal, this kind of very misguided goal, that all we have to do is understand matter, and by extension, therefore we will understand the properties of matter, which are presumed to be thinking, and consciousness. That's just presumed to be a property of matter. So, and again, he's, this is what this whole chapter is about. We're just diving into this excerpt here, but this whole presumption that matter is primary is he's turning this all around. He's showing that this cannot be true. We cannot base science on this. We cannot make that our starting point. So, and I'll give you a little bit more of the context, what he said earlier in this book as well, that there is, if you really trace back the history of Western philosophy, and other traditions as well do similar kind of things. But in our Western tradition of philosophy, we have what he lays out. There are two really big directions that philosophy tried to go in. One was the word monism, and the other was the word dualism. So here, when we come to this part of the chapter, what he's talking about here is he's really spelling out one of the particular offshoots of monism, which is materialism. The material way of thinking is one of the forms of monism. And what monism means, what that word means, is that really it's kind of the both the scientific and the philosophical quest to find the one unifying concept that all of the universe really falls under. So whether in the case of materialism, the monistic view in that case says that everything there is, everything we can know, everything we can observe is all matter, atoms and molecules. And as we said in last week's video, the this bias of materialism in the health sciences reduces the entirety of the human being down to matter. There's no mind, there's no consciousness. All of those things are just properties of matter. So everything gets reduced to matter. So that's what he's talking about here. I thought I would just go back half a step there and give you a bit of the context he's talking about in here. So to read this next excerpt, he says, whoever immediately counters the view of thinking developed here with the statement of Cabanis, that's just another author, that the brain secretes thoughts as the liver does gall, or the salivary ducts saliva, simply does not know what I am talking about. So what he's pointing to here is this view that thinking or thoughts are just produced by the brain the same way that our liver or our gall our liver produces gall, like that basic liver chemical, or the salivary ducts produce saliva. Well, to the materialist, it's no different. The brain just produces thoughts. It's just a byproduct of the brain processes. So So that's it. That's all the materialist says. And then this all very, very critical thought here. He says, as an object of world content, thinking eludes normal observation, as I have shown. Those who cannot overcome materialism lack the capacity to induce in themselves the exceptional state that brings into consciousness what remains unconscious during all other spiritual activities. So I have to give you the background here. He's prepared a lot of things before this paragraph, and I'm just going to explain them now. And right here we see the words he's using. He's comparing normal observation, is one phrase he uses, and he's comparing that with, what does he say here? The exceptional state. So what is this exceptional state that he's talking about compared to normal observation? Well, let me just move myself back on camera here. When he's talking about the exceptional state, or let me start from the other way. When he's talking about the normal state, the normal way of observing and the normal way of thinking, that's the state where we're not even aware of of the fact that we're thinking. We are, it's kind of like, I think I've said this in a previous video, when we are it's like when we're driving our car, when we're already a learned practiced driver, we're not a beginner driver. We already, we've been driving for years. We're just driving around in our car. We're not thinking about driving. We're just thinking about where we're going. I'm going to the store, I'm going here, I'm going there, and we're just using our internalized skill of driving to get us there, right? So I'm using this kind of as an analogy, but this is what Steiner is talking about in this section. He's talking about how in that normal state of thinking, we're not aware of thinking as a living process. We're just as I say, we're in the car being taken somewhere, so to speak, but we're not. We don't even remember that we know how to drive, and oh yeah, I'm shifting into another gear, and I'm putting my foot on the brake, and I'm doing this. We're usually not thinking about how we're driving. We're just driving. We're just doing it. So that's what he means by the normal state, is that we are in our thinking, we're using our thinking, but we're not really raising it to a higher level of awareness within us. We're just focused on the content of our thinking. So I'm thinking about my dog, I'm thinking about a tree, I'm thinking about this or that. We're all focused on the content of our thinking, but as I say, we're not usually we're very unaware of the thinking, the process of thinking itself. So that's what he means, to go back to that excerpt, when he talks about the exceptional state. That's precisely what he's talking about, is when we can get into that state, what we're calling living thinking, or dynamic thinking, as we've called it elsewhere. That's what Steiner calls the exceptional state, and that's what he means there. When we get into that abnormal or not normal state, where we are thinking, we are aware of the thinking that we're using. We can see that as this living activity. We are. It's kind of like, if let's say, if it's the difference between, between being, seeing a theater performance, you're sitting in your seat and you're watching the play unfold, you're watching the actors say their lines, and you're not even, necessarily thinking they're actors. You're kind of in the story and you're watching them perform it, versus being someone who's behind stage. Maybe there's, someone who's doing the lighting or doing something technical. They're very aware of what all the technical things that are happening on the stage. And in fact, they're helping with the lighting and whatever the technical things that are going on. That's kind of more of a heightened awareness of how that play is being produced. Now, of course, we can have that awareness sitting in the audience, but usually we're trying to lose ourselves and just be, just have that story unfolding before us. We just want the story and we want to forget about the technical side. So anyways, I'm using that as an analogy again, but when he here talks about this exceptional state, that's precisely what he's talking about. When we can, we can be aware of the technical fact that we are involved in that living activity of thinking, and it's not just the thoughts we have, but it's our awareness of our own thinking that's producing those thoughts. So it's a little bit of a meta state, you can call it. But this is so critical. I'm kind of explaining some of the background here, but I'm going to read this one more time when he says, those who cannot overcome materialism lack the capacity to induce in themselves the exceptional state. Okay, so materialism there, he's telling us, it is basically this blockage that we with that materialism bias, we cannot get into this exceptional state, or what we're calling as living thinking. So I'm going to bring out another excerpt here, or it's actually a diagram, but this is our key point we want to talk about today, is when that bias of materialism is, part of somebody's whole makeup, the whole structure of their mind body, their consciousness. That materialism bias blocks some very important things in our physiology, and living thinking, or the exceptional state, as Steiner calls it, is one of them. So I'm going to bring up this other diagram now. Let me go back to my screen here. And this is from a book by Charles Konya. He's a medical ergonomist. And I just pulled this diagram out for our purposes today. We can, in future videos, we will likely come back to this diagram and talk about it in a lot more detail. But just the key points I want to focus on here. The general overall structure of this diagram is that you see on the side here, the bottom represents the depth of the human structure. And as you go up, to the top of the diagram, we get more and more to the outer superficial expression of the human structure. So way down at the depths, the core of the human structure is where we have, the basic cosmic orgone energy. That's that basic living energy that infuses all of the cosmos, and it especially flows through the human being, and of course animates our physical body, but also animates our consciousness and animates our thinking. So that's at the core. That's, in our terms, in what we've been talking about in this video series, that's where we're talking about this dynamic, or this living thinking, or what Steiner called the exceptional state. We're right at we're right connected to the base, the core of creation, the base of human consciousness, the base of living energy. We're right there at, as life is unfolding within us, we are right there with it. We are riding the wave, as it were, if we want to use an expression. And as you go up through these different layers, you get different forms of well, at one level, different forms of distorted forms of cognition. We get distortions and illusions. We start working our way up into this more pathological human structure. At the base, number 9 here, that's the core of healthy functioning. But as we work up our way through the base of, as I'm saying, through different distortions of cognition, or the other way of looking at it, through different kinds of bodily armor. When we get muscular armor, and stiffness in different muscular functions, stiffness even in our emotions, stiffness in our thinking, all the way up until way at the top now, as we have all these different layers of armoring and pathology. This number 1 and number 2 is what he now calls, it can either be mechanistic materialism or metaphysical idealism. For our purpose today, we're focusing on the mechanistic materialism. And when you're at that layer, now this is a whole, basically a pathological structure of the human being, where the person who's deeply materialistic in this sense, they don't even realize that they think they're being logical, but actually they're just expressing what comes out of the whole pathological structure of their whole mind body organism, right? So once you get that level of armoring, that level of distortion, the materialism seems like it's logical, but it's actually this great distortion taking us away from this core of functioning, this core of consciousness. So to go back to Rudolf Steiner for a moment, when he says those who cannot overcome materialism lack the capacity to induce in themselves the exceptional state. So he's just saying it very directly like that, but we have to go to Charles Konya to really understand this deeper kind of pathological process that somebody would have to undergo to really undo in themselves. Of course, this is the whole process of Heilkunst medicine and getting someone to their full state of health. Really what's happening along the way, once we understand Steiner, we understand ergonomy, we start to see that this is really this is a process that you can't just undo, through the process of pure logic. You cannot see that logic when you're in that kind of armored pathological kind of state of materialism, as Steiner is saying here, and and uh, and as well as we're seeing in the diagram, the Konya diagram that I was showing you. So all of that shows us that we cannot, we cannot take it as a pure logical expression. It's just like, oh yeah, A plus B equals C. That all seems logical, but same with the materialists. It seems so logical. Well, all that thinking is just a byproduct of our brain process. But when you really understand that living dynamic, what Steiner calls the exceptional state, what we've been calling living thinking, that does not fit into that logic anymore. You have to take that down into a deeper living biological capacity, and that's where we get, that's where we get this capacity for living thinking. So to tie this all up, for the theme of these videos that we've been doing in this, obviously is a very specific philosophy and an approach we use in Heilkunst medicine. But once we really understand what's really being said here, we don't have to leave it, strictly in the consult rooms of the Heilkünstler. We can bring it out to anyone in the world at large. And this process of living thinking is available to everyone. But just to, as I was saying at the beginning of today's video, and as I was saying last week, the more we can start to unpack our unconscious biases, the more that we can get into these very healthy living functions, thinking functions, all the dynamics of being fully alive and having our full capacities to us. And when we get into something like materialism, this has just been one example, but it's a very pervasive one. It's a very powerful one. This is one of the biases we want to undo in ourselves and make sure that that it's not interfering with you being fully alive and fully present to your whole human living functioning. So I'll leave it at that today, but I just, as I said, wanted to unpack this point we pointed to last week, but I wanted to bring more of that out. Thank you for joining me. I will see you again in the next video. You can follow wherever you're watching this, on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching it. Just keep watching that channel, and I will see you again next week.